Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, a PhD student in Russian Lit.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, and this last week, Matt and I got to be in-person Tipsy Tolstoy boys as I went out to Chicago to visit Matt, and we had an excellent time just doing all kinds of debauchery and also we so many things happened. I really can't even describe it, but I just want to bring to your attention the fact that we tried to order McDonald's at 1 a.m., and I don't know what happened. It's not clear to me, but we ended up with like 2 full bags of just sauces and fries. I think we had 12 to 15 large fries, which we did not order. And that was a lot to handle, very drunk at 1 a.m. But, interesting, cool experience.
We managed.
we overcame. But yes, that was good. It was good to, if you followed our Instagram story, you would have seen some of our debauchery.
You would have seen it. You had to be there. This is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron remotely get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. This week, we're going to be returning to our good old handy-dandy socialist realism with part 2 of Fyodor Gladkov's novel Cement.
If you want to say in what we're going to be reading next, head on over to patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. For as little as $3 a month, you can keep your favorite Russian literature podcast running and join in on fun events like movie nights on Discord. Winky face, excuse me. That's a little addition from Matt there.
You're welcome.
Thank you, yeah. If you are not interested in Patreon but still want to help us out, you can leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts or sign up for our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
Yeah, this is a little embarrassing, but I found out today that as I was going back through the website, when I was redoing the website, I took the email list sign-up form down and forgot to put it back up until I was going back through it. So, hey, if you've been wondering, how can I get on this ultra-exclusive email list? Well, you better sign up now before I take it back off and forget to put it on again.
Well, speaking of, sorry to clown on you. Speaking of organizational incompetence relevant to the reading, Matt, what are you drinking today?
I'm drinking a sparkling water and vodka because I'm trying to keep it light comparatively to all of the beer that is still trying to exit my system from our weekend.
That's fair. That's very valid.
Yeah. What about you?
I should be doing the same, but I'm very excited to announce this. I went to go get a craft beer today at my local Total Wine and found something which I have not seen in the U.S. ever, actually. I have in front of me a Baltika 9.
Oh my God, you got one?
There were only 8 in the store. I bought all of them. If you don't know, Baltika is a line of beers put out by, I forget the manufacturer. It's like the biggest importer of beers in Russia. Their manufacturing facility is in St. Petersburg, and their kind of flagship line is Baltika, which is like 0 through 9. Each number is a different type of beer. Baltika 9s are just a lager, but they've got extra alcohol added. And it was the number one beer that Matt and I bought stumbling home drunk late at night in Russia. So many good, well, I'd say many memories, but actually this usually accompany a lack of memory. So many good times.
Many things that probably happened.
Yeah. But so excited about this. But anyway,
I'm jealous.
I'll send you one.
Heck yeah. All right. So Cement, you said you liked part 2 better than part 1. How come?
Yes. It was, and I don't know how many people this is going to reach or how many people are going to feel this, but part 2, like we said before in our Heart of a Dog episode, that book, at least in our interpretation, was a sort of forum with the public, with people at the time. This is kind of the same thing, but it's not really an attempt to engage with the public. It's an inner life of thought of politics within at this time it's the Bolshevik Party, but still contains elements of like some social revolutionaries or SRAs, although they're not really mentioned in this book. But most importantly, Mensheviks, of whom Leon Trotsky was an actual member, which is important for some of the reasons why there are alterations made to this book. Anyway, the latter half of this book is just like a lot of those differing political ideologies, and not even ideologies, just approaches to this new reality, which are very much in dialogue. And Gladkov kind of has some interesting things to say about it. It's a little grim, some of his proclamations, but I think it's fascinating. I think this book, I'm fully on board with you, Matt, now that I've read the whole thing. I think it really has gotten a bad rap. This is perhaps not the most artistically talented book, but it is really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I feel like personally I was not expecting a polished piece of prose from Gladkov. Like, he didn't come from a like a literature background, and he wrote this when he was still pretty young. So I think some of the prose is forgivable, if not kind of touching. There are some of my favorite lines of literature ever written in this book, which I can touch on a little later. But yeah, the second read through, I was struck at how specific it was at parts with some of the politics and whatnot of the time. I was like, this is probably why more than anything people don't read this, because people just don't really care to understand what this small period of time was like in Russia, besides us.
Besides us, it's really just us and overachieving undergrads.
Yeah.
Or underachieving grad students.
Hey, you watch yourself there.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So let's cover what happens in the second half of the book. And it's a lot, so I'm going to be covering it very much in brief. I do want to say before we get into it, there is going to be mention of sexual assault later in this. So if that's not something you want to hear, I'm going to put in the show notes the timings of when you can jump around to avoid that. I don't know what's going to happen yet, but just take a look at that. We'll drop them right in there. Last time we left off, we have just had a battle with some unknown forces at the site of the factory, and although some members of the workers have been killed, for the most part, it's a daring victory. This is kind of the height of the book emotionally for most of these characters, and it all gets worse from here in typical Russian fashion. Following this event, Gleb and Dasha are walking home, and Mikhova decides to join them, and it's very obvious that she is like really infatuated with Gleb. She's like just holding onto his arm, and they're chatting, and even Gleb seems to notice that Dasha is noticing. The only really important part about this is that along the way, Mikhova begins to express some doubts about the new economic policy, or the NEP, which I believe we talked about in more depth in our Alexandra Kollontai episode. But if you don't remember briefly, it was the kind of reintegration of markets in a limited form of like old-fashioned in quotes capitalism into the new Bolshevik context. I say old-fashioned because the major addition that Lenin has to Marxist-Leninism is the new formulation of capitalism as not just a like physical capital owning land and stuff, but also the capitalization of our reality, which is like the best example would be the stock market, is a modern form of capitalism, which Lenin writes on, and that's what makes Marxist-Leninism different from Marxism. That's what I mean by that. So she expresses she's not really happy with the NEP, and Gleb and Dasha are kind of like, it's fine. Well, this is just part of the stages of coming to a socialist society. Mikhova leaves, and Gleb and Dasha go out to the sea, and Dasha finally reveals what happened and really why she is so different from the person that Gleb left behind. We mentioned in the last episode that the machinist, Kleist, basically got Gleb killed, but he managed to escape by getting out of the cellar. So when Gleb escaped from those white officers, he was able to go back home, rest for a little bit, and then he runs off into the night to go join the Greens. Like we mentioned last time, the Greens are a non-white, non-red force in the Civil War who kind of changed sides. Different green forces had different alignments, whatever. These are what so-called the Red Greens. And Dasha begins to help these Red Greens as they kind of come along, providing them with supplies, cooking for them. For some soldiers, that she puts them up for the night, and this is important for her character development. She sleeps with some of them. Eventually, the white forces realize what's going on to a limited degree, and they bring in her, another green soldier from the woods, as well as another green widow, Fimka, along with her brother Petra, who is also a green, and they are tortured quite extensively. This is actually kind of I don't usually think of as Gladkov as that good of a writer, but this is actually a surprisingly hard to read torture. I mean, like torture scenes in general are hard to read, but this one kind of rings true in a certain way that other times I've read torture, it is not. And they are all taken out to be shot by the coast, but Dasha is saved at the last moment by Kleist, who's taken responsibility for her. Shortly after that, Dasha gives up Nurka to their neighbors Savchuk and Motya, and begins to dedicate herself entirely to the cause, having been through this really traumatic experience and also almost being executed. And also, the executions themselves are also hard to read. I mean, the Gladkov spares you nothing in the begging for life, and oh boy.
Yeah, there's some really graphic detail in the second part, especially.
Yeah, that actually is some excellent writing there. I'll give him that. So we jump back into the modern era, and now the communist forces, not the party itself, but Sergei, along with Gleb and some other of the named characters, are now putting the bourgeoisie out of their houses. There's still bourgeois elements existing in this society. At this time, they're kind of going through their house and saying, these things can be used for X, Y, and Z. We're going to be expropriating them. They get all the bourgeois and put them into a sort of group in order to be marched off to somewhere. It's not really made clear. The important thing here is that Sergei's father is among these, or Sergei's family, his mother is dead at this point, is among these, being an old kind of intellectual. And Sergei, with Gleb's recommendation, does not continue on to his father's house to put him out of house and home. That's too difficult for him to do. And he just kind of leaves, although his father's librarian comes and gets on his case a little bit about it. He just gets on his case about his father being put out of house and home. And then the crowd is let out, and while they're being gathered, the whites attack, and now we go into a period of kind of guerrilla combat where everyone's on guard. We're spending most of the time with Sergei and Gleb kind of talking at night as they talk about what they need. Again, Makova comes back again to harp on the NEP. And the important thing here is that Sergei and Gleb stalk an enemy soldier and capture him through the night during an ambush. And it turns out that it's Sergei's brother, Dmitry. Dmitry is formerly a member of the Red Army, and Dmitry at this point seems quite thoroughly disenchanted with the Bolshevik Party, and ends up taunting Sergei. And he knows that it's his death, and keeps asking Sergei if Sergei will be there when they execute him, and will this be quite romantic? And Sergei is already having lost his father in a sense that day, and his mother's dead, and the librarian kind of friend he has is also turned away from him. He feels, I think this is when his father is turned out, but in this moment, the way he's like just detaching, it's very apparent that Sergei is his connections to his old life are like snapping like piano wire. He is fully dissociating from a lot of things. After things slow down a little bit, the town's returning to normal economic activity. And in fact, it's more than normal, because now their shops are beginning to open up. Shops, cooperatives, cafes, food is being brought in, normal things are being sold. And here, Gleb is walking through town when he sees Makhova just kind of staring into a window, and he stops and says, what's going on? Are you okay? And she's staring at all the goods and says she's troubled by the new economic policy. After all the things they've suffered and all the blood they've wasted, how could they go back to the exact same system they had before? What was the point of it all, really? Gleb is kind of like on her side a little bit, and she says to him, I'm kind of sick. Can you walk me back to my room? I don't want to go to work today. And he brings back, and she's still complaining with the NEP, and as they go in the room, she asks him to hug her, and he does, and he seems to be very on her side until there's a knock at the door, and Dasha comes in, staring down at the two with vague hurt in her eyes, although Makova kind of quickly gets up and says, Gleb is a good man. He was helping me out. I was quite feeling under the weather, and Gleb quickly makes his exit as Dasha begins to talk to Makova about an economic report they need to give.
And then there's a record scratch, and the studio audience is like really anxious. It's really good.
Can you imagine this book as like a sitcom? That would be the worst sitcom.
It would be, but it could also be the basis of like a really good irreverent sitcom. I'm not sure exactly what that word means, but Netflix keeps telling me I like those kind of shows, so I guess that's good.
I feel like it would be a sitcom if Albert Camus had unlimited creative control over a sitcom.
It would be a sitcom only if you could take perhaps all nuance of political discussion out of it, because the American public does not care.
The American public especially does not care about the politics that were really only applicable for like a 3 to 4 year period in the early Soviet Union.
You can really only keep their attention if like every couple minutes somebody comes out and yells Stalin and then goes back. That's about it.
I feel like that would also if in this kind of existential sitcom, if nothing else related to Stalin, but every once in a while someone just come out to yell at as some sort of meta commentary on the way that Russian culture in the American context is inexorably linked to Stalin, regardless of whether or not that's actually. I think we're kind of. We'll come back to that. We'll pitch some ideas on Patreon, see what they think.
We'll kick it around.
Yeah. Soon after that, an English steamer comes to the port. On board, there are a number of soldiers and officers. These are all members of the White Army who have been basically trying to run, but no port anywhere has accepted them because they've all been captured by the Bolsheviks. So they land and say, whatever you want to do to us, it's fine. We accept our fate. They are all obviously half dead. And the only important thing here is that there's just a lot of back and forth. Gleb meets some Cossacks who rebelled against the White Army and are now wanting to fight for them. And Gleb is telling them, your fight before was on the battlefield, but now it's in the factory, the real fight, the exciting one, you see. Sergei meets a woman on board who he vaguely recognizes, it's never really elaborated on, who kind of expresses a fear of communists, but says like, well, what can you help me understand? And he kind of turns from her and says, I can't help you understand. Only the love of working can help you understand. Furthering his kind of evolution from a more personable kind of guy who is he's a Menshevik. It's not stated until later in the book, but the Mensheviks are traditionally a bit more associated with the intellectual wing of the party, a bit further removed from the working class of the party, like Gleb and Dasha are. He, after losing all connections, is cold to her and says, only work can teach you to love the Communist Party.
He'd just be the worst person to get advice from. Just the worst.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Sergei in some ways is the main character of this book, but man, you should not take advice from Sergei.
No.
After that, we kind of jump out of the main characters they've been following here and follow a kind of unknown soldier. God, I can't even say this. Shkeladze. He's Georgian. We
My head does the same thing every time I try and pronounce it too. It's difficult.
How would you say it?
I don't know.
Fair enough. So we follow some daily life in the kind of cafeteria as people are eating and the many people in there. And really importantly, we're watching Badin, Shram. Shram again is that kind of egghead who is part of many departments, but none of the departments that actually do anything. So he's not technically responsible for anything. Suskin, a doctor, and he heads up public health, and Chapka, who is the commissar of the local food department. And after they eat, they go into a private room, and it's heavily implied that they drink and eat sausage and have access to all these things that no one else does until late into the night, which Skladza considers kind of shameful and ends up kind of yelling at them about, but they push him away, not quite ejecting him from the party, but telling him, go home, just forget about this. Really, you're a good soldier, Skladza, but so we're gonna kind of overlook this. At the same time, Dasha is visiting the children's home occasionally, and Nurka is withering away, their daughter, and she's got some kind of disease. The doctors don't know what it is, and really nothing can be done for her. For the first time in this book, we really see Dasha crack after leaving the children's home one night, knowing essentially that her daughter is going to die and she can't do anything about it. This is kind of the first time that's made real for her, so she kind of throws herself on the ground and cries. Mekhova, at the same time, is increasingly dispossessed of her former ideas. Many victims of the famine in the Volga region are showing up in town. They're begging for food, and there's not that much to give from the common stores. However, because of the NEP, there's now food stores, which are not part of the kind of the communal space. There are stores, cafe, well-dressed people who do have access to food, which is not part of the communal supply and therefore cannot be freely given to these starving people. And Mekhova is just, she doesn't know what to do. Why would this revolution happen? And when she's thinking about it in her room, Badin kind of bursts in, and earlier when Mekhova and Gleb are talking, she kind of alludes to that she feels that this is kind of inevitable. Badin is not a good guy. He already tried to sexually assault Dasha previously, and now in this time he sexually assaults Mekhova in her room. And following this, another very difficult scene to read, which is, it's not super drawn out, but it's very indirectly addressed, but difficult section. She goes to Sergei, who lives right across the way, in her apartment. Even though he's become so disconnected from people around here, he forms an emotional attachment and begins to care for her after these events. Going back to technically our main character, Gleb, he walks into the factory and finds that it's not working at the order of some council or other. It doesn't matter which one. And he threatens to shoot the lot of the administration for obeying those kind of orders, and is going off to yell at whatever committees he can find who might even vaguely be related to this, because it's really not clear who does what. But he's stopped by Dasha, who informs him that Nurka is dead, and he notes that it feels like there's some kind of connection between the two of them that's now been severed forever because of that. So now we're coming to the end of the book, and we're coming to kind of a weird moment because a purge is approaching. They're going to be some Bolsheviks coming by and basically looking over everyone's case and figuring out who should no longer be a member of the party. And no one feels good about this. Everyone has been so much conflict. And in many ways, what makes someone a good member of the party is less your ideological rigor or your character, rather than how useful have you been to the extant administration. So the usual characters have been quite worried, and there's a long kind of trial scene. A lot happens. To sum it all up, Sergei is ejected for reasons that they will not disclose to him. They tell him when you get the report, you'll finally find out. As a side note, he never actually does get that report. Dasha has to get it for him. He's kicked out solely because he's a Menshevik. Zhuk, I don't think we mentioned a whole lot. He's a worker who's quite good at what he does, but he's a troublemaker, so he is kicked out. Mekhova is kicked out of the party because of her statements about the NEP, even though at her trial she gives an impassioned speech against this sort of corruption of the party, and everyone in the crowd agrees with her. That says, yeah, Mekhova's right. What did we fight for if we're just going to returning to our former set of relations? The Bolshevik said, well, the thing is that we've not advanced to full communism yet. Yes, you are correct, Comrade Mekhova, but you're naive. This is not the stage of history we're in yet, so we have to do what we have to do to survive. And we don't need idealists in our party, even if you're technically more ideologically pure than we are. And she's kicked out.
Even if you're technically right.
Yeah, so everyone who's been kicked out just feels dead, politically dead. There's nothing they can do. And Sergei retires back to his apartment, and he does hear Mekhova, and he wants to go to her. But they've developed an emotional connection, but there's just something between them that keeps them separated. I think this is a line. Sergei reads Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism, and one thing that stands out is the line, "Everything lies in methods and not words. Dialectics are energy." So that's important for understanding some of these things in the book. Following that, work continues as normal. Even though these people have been kicked out of the party, they're still there. We're not at the stage yet where people are being kicked out of the party and executed. This is just you're out of the party. Nothing really changes for you. You might become kind of a social pariah to a certain extent, but most of the people who've been kicked out are actually quite popular and supported by the others. So they go back to work, and they work on their appeals, and the others, Dasha, Gleb, help trying to get back into the party and work on their appeals. But everything stays the same technically. Work at the factory is going well. Kleist is now fully coming around to who is the man who used to be the engineer who lorded over everyone else, is fully committed to the cause. And Gleb looks at Kleist, and where once he saw someone who's oppressing him as a working class member, Gleb now sees a friend in Kleist. And that's an interesting thing, who ends the book kind of on a winning note. Mekhova, the perhaps most ideologically pure communist in the book, is now listless. She doesn't know what to do. She's eventually sent to a sanitarium. And before that, Dasha leaves Gleb essentially to go help Mekhova. She's not an outcast. She's just out of the party, and she's kind of falling apart. And that's an interesting scene because Gleb kind of knows in this moment that as she leaves, it doesn't matter if she comes back or not. And he doesn't think she's going to come back. But even if she does come back, this is kind of a final goodbye in a way. This is the ultimate goodbye to any understanding of their old relationship. And we'll get into that later because I think it's really interesting. And she takes off and takes care of Mekhova until Mekhova is sent to a sanitarium. Shram, that kind of egghead, he actually is sent to Siberia. And then Badin becomes the leader, the chairman of the local council. No, sorry, Shram is not sent to Siberia. Shram is arrested, but Shabis, we may have mentioned he's the head of the local Cheka, he's sent to Siberia, which is interesting. The two of the three real careerists, those high up in the actual mechanics, are purged, and the last one who survives is promoted. Funny things of the Soviet system. And Gleb and Badin do not end the book on a good note. They're clashing. They're not having a good time because Gleb, Badin, Dasha, they're kind of some of the biggest now movers and shakers. They're often working together, and Gleb and Badin are always on each other's, like trying to stand on each other's toes. Dasha basically is the one who has to de-escalate things and defends Badin as a good worker. So Gleb understands why Badin is there, but he doesn't like it. Dasha doesn't like Badin, but she understands why he's there, and she'll go to bat for Badin, even though he is unambiguously a terrible person. He's also a very useful person, and he is rewarded for that. Off to the side, Sergei walking along sees a dead baby with a red handkerchief on its head. We'll come back to that. A lot of things we'll come back to. And then finally we end on thousands of people, maybe the whole of this town, turning out to see Engineer Kleist receive an award. Gleb kind of dissociates before he's going to give a speech, and remembers the last time he saw Mikhova before she went off to the sanitarium. And he and Dasha, he's kind of pushed away, and he now feels from these two women, Dasha and Mikhova, who he once was so close and had maybe the closest ties to, just an absolute dearth of understanding. And he leaves, and he's shaken back to the present, and he gives a final victory speech as if he's in a dream, declaring onward to victory, comrades. And although he's like borderline dissociating, the whole crowd ends in cheering and and it's a happy ending ? It's a weird one. It's fascinating to me.
Wasn't the ending that you thought it was going to take, I bet?
Well, I mean, the last pages, yeah, that's what I expected, but that's kind of a turnabout face. And even then, it's described as if in a dream. So this, Gleb is still clearly pretty out of it, remembering things that he does not understand and he still feels terrible about, which is fascinating.
Well, I'm glad that I've taken you over to my side, the cementy side.
It's you and me on the cement is good committee.
That's it.
It has to be a committee.
It has to be a committee.
So, as the leader and founder of the Cement is Good committee, what strikes you about the second half of the book? What stands out to you about this stuff?
Well, biggest thing from the second half, a recurring segment I'd like to start is where I pick my favorite bad line of the book. And so I'd like to start our discussion off with this beautiful piece of ornamental prose from page 154 on our copy, if you're reading along. Above the distant ranges, the sun was like blood, and the big-toothed black mountains gnawed as at a fiery pancake. I don't know why that one got me, but I loved it. There was, I think, several pancake references. I have nothing to add other than I like that.
That's fair. That's valid.
That's what struck me about the second half. Thanks for listening to the podcast. So not to break in, I don't know if there's anything you specifically wanted to address, but I wanted to kind of address the elephant in the room first before we kind of discussed more broadly what interested us. Which elephant? There's like 3. It's like there's like a horde of elephants.
It's just a whole whatever a group of elephants is called. The one that stands out to me is Gleb, because Gleb is in every way he's the prototypical Soviet socialist hero. He is, at least in the first half of the book. He was a hero of the Red Army. He comes back and all he wants to do is start up a factory again. And frankly, to the extent that it's almost neurotic, everyone else around him is, even like the eggheads are like, why do we don't need more, with like the Council of Cement isn't asking for more cement. And yeah, of course we can't trust the council. We see how they operate, but I don't know if they're just like saying we don't need more cement. That there might be a point that maybe you don't need to start a cement factory.
Could you imagine being the other person at the office? Like, who is this guy with the cement?
Yeah, but even later in the book, I think when the whites are attacking, he even thinks, do we need this? He thinks on page 191 in our copy, how then was it possible to make plans for the revival of the factory? How could one think of that now, when people were condemned to famine rations, and some were so weak that they could not stand the strain of a working day? He's not even entirely certain they've got people to man the factory, and he knows about that, but that doesn't entirely stop him. He really is the prototypical Soviet hero, but it's interesting that is kind of subverted throughout the book in so many ways. First of all, he's very deeply sexist and very got traditional masculinity on his mind, something that he's called out for by his wife quite a lot. And almost, well, no, not in every case, even though in most other circumstances he's portrayed as being the level-headed one that everyone else should listen to. In any case, when Dasha gets on his case about his sexism, she's always, the text always frames her as correct, giving her the last word every time, which is fascinating. And towards the end, his wife leaving him and him feeling bad about that up to the very moment when he has to give a speech about how things are going great, but inside he's kind of falling apart. That's not what you'd expect, and that's certainly an element which you lose, I would imagine, in later socialist realism once it becomes a canon rather than just, something that was written and is ascribed to being a socialist realist text.
Yeah, I haven't read a lot of the later editions, but I also have a sneaking suspicion that there's not this kind of ambiguous ending.
In many ways, this is kind of a grim ending.
Yeah.
This is not, it's not entirely positive on obviously it's a pro-Bolshevik book. In many ways, it's even a pro-Menshevik book more than it is a Bolshevik book, which is also very changed in later editions. But it's just really interesting. And so in many ways, I think Gleb is the least interesting character in relation to Dasha, Mekhova, and Sergei. But I don't think the book could have been he kind of had to have him as a baseline. The others are interesting in relation to him as kind of like this unquestioning hero of the Bolshevik Party. So I think I kind of love Gleb, even though he's by far, in my mind, not the real hero of the book, not the real protagonist, really.
Yeah, he's interesting. He's like exactly what you said. He's exactly what you expect when you go into this book. But I think that's why I like the book, because it gives you this glimpse into the lives of other people that end up being far more interesting than he is. I personally don't find him as interesting. The narrator can be interesting at times. Whether the narrator is always Gleb, I don't know. Usually, right, but not all. Sometimes there's a striking level of depth of analysis that I wouldn't ascribe to Gleb being able to do.
Sometimes I think that's maybe not directly, but kind of indirectly written from Sergei's perspective, because, like I said, Sergei is a Menshevik, or he was a Menshevik, which is, again, the party that Trotsky was associated with. And I think maybe relevant to this example, Trotsky has a lot of ideas. And I'm going to be careful here, because the last time we talked about Bolshevik politics, someone I know who actually knows a lot about socialist politics got on me for some of my statements. Trotsky very much believed in the worldwide revolution of communism, like not just stopping at the Russian state, but looking outward. Not that everything he did was towards that, but that was the basic idea, and that's the basic conflict he has with Stalin. That's why he becomes a kind of an opposition leader to Stalin, where kind of towards the end of his life, this is a little bit Lenin too, but this is primarily Stalin, begins to focus on not socialism in the world, but socialism in the USSR, defending against enemies abroad, enemies within. That becomes a primary feature of that, but whereas Trotsky is always kind of looking outward and always has a much more intellectualist kind of perspective on it, which Sergei always does. And I think in many ways, Sergei is kind of posed to be right. He's a lot more empathetic than a lot of the other characters, and a lot more understanding, and a lot more tragic. I mean, he's got to turn his father out of his house. He captures his brother who's executed, and he feels bad about all that. And his father and his brother feel an acute sense of irony in that, and kind of joke with him about it, and refuse to give him any succor. I don't know how to say that word, in regards to his desire for, father, come live with me. You don't have to be exiled. And his father says, I don't want to stay here. And he actually says to him, look, little Sergei, how history is never new. I am a certain blind old man, Oedipus, and this is my daughter, Antigone. Antigone is a reference to Verochka, the librarian. They've got this like acute sense of irony. He's Sergei is the most literary character in a way, the most tragic. And he, I would say, in like the same way that Mekhova is posed as right, but early. Like they're the ones who are the thinkers, and like in many ways, I think we're supposed to sympathize with them, but sympathizing in a way that's like, well, they're naive. It sucks. They're tragic. They're tragic because they're early. Our era is an era of dasha, of people who are not as well read but are learning and are hard of will. Our era is an era of badin, a person who may be just absolutely the worst, but who knows how to get things done. That's what we need right now. We don't need high-minded dreamers. We need badin, which is a really grim proclamation. And it's almost, I find it so fascinating that the book, that's kind of the perspective on the book. It's not, it is a very clear-eyed book in that regard. It's not uncomplicated. It's kind of, it has like a clear perspective on what the right thing is, but it's also not like, well, we're not going to hide that I think the right thing is kind of shitty. In many ways, they talk about how Sergei and Gleb often talk about how the sins of their era will hopefully be washed away by a future era, which is better, and they will look back upon us and forgive our sins because of what we built. But they do regard them as sins, which is interesting.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking back at it right now because for me, the most interesting part on the reread was kind of going back through the trials and the interrogation, and I do think that it is a narrator, but it's almost certainly has to be from Sergei's point of view, because it's so out of left field compared to how everyone else talks and thinks. He's thinking on the narrator, presumably from Sergei's point of view, is reflecting on kind of the nature of the interrogation, and he comes out with this beautiful quote: "Do questions ever reveal the soul of man? Are answers to them ever convincing or true? There are no right questions and no true answers. Truth is that which questions do not invoke, and it cuts right across all answers, having its own direction." Which, again, I think very high-minded compared to the rest of the book, but it's also a really interesting condemnation on the paranoia and the purges more generally. Just the fact that they already know what they're looking for. I mean, he's cast out of the party for something, for being a Menshevik, but he was associated with the Mensheviks, I think, really early on. The things that he is really accused of doing, I mean, it's pretty minuscule, I would say.
Yeah.
They already know what they're searching for when they're coming out with these questions, essentially.
And regardless of, to your point, Sergei is not unpopular. I mean, he's ejected from the party for affecting party morale, but undoubtedly his ejection hurt party morale way more than his involvement ever did, which the text does not exactly say, but everything about the way the text is written kind of implies that. I mean, it most ambiguously supports Dasha of anyone, and Dasha goes out of her way to help Sergei get the report, first of all, but also try to appeal it for him even before he says anything about it.
I think that Sergei's also, I don't know exactly what to make of it, but I would agree with where you're heading probably. I think that he's kind of linked to it at the end of the book when he finds the dead baby, which is cool. I thought that's the elephant in the room we were going to talk about, because that was super jarring way to kind of put towards the last 3 pages of your book. Just the idea that the world is completely upside down and the natural order being completely disrupted. And he's kind of the only one that seems to see that, I think. I mean, Dasha does, of course. Dasha has some things that she does and says that are not really quite in character necessarily. I know we're talking about Nurka a little bit, and I guess we can compare and contrast these two, because Gladkov gives us an ample amount of dead children to compare and contrast, unfortunately. But there's this quote: "Dasha knew better than all the doctors in the world why Nurka was fading out like a little star at dawn. It is not only the mother's milk which a child needs, it is nourished also by the heart and the tenderness of its mother." And it's kind of a surprising twist and turn towards the end. But I think she's kind of portrayed positively for being able to overcome that kind of cycle. I talked about it a little bit when we did the Kollontai episode, which if you're interested in where I'm heading with it, you should check out that episode, because I talked about Eric Naiman's book, Sex in Public, which is super interesting, fascinating read on specifically this issue and how, part of the incarnation of Soviet ideology was in effect to sort of transcend these sort of natural cycles, specifically childbirth.
Right, which is something that's not... I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but it's portrayed positively, but it's also not portrayed as the only way, maybe. We have, for example, the contrast of Motsia against him, who by the end of the book is kind of that sort of stands in for that sort of traditional motherhood, and that by the end of the book, she's very pregnant, about to give birth again, and even though Savchuk has been, I think Savchuk is also ejected from the party, they've got their family, and she's like, that's all I need, my family. And I don't think she's portrayed badly for wanting that. And it's like there's two different. I mean, she's not portrayed as positively as Dasha, as like this force of change, but she just exists as what they are. And it doesn't feel like a condemnation; it just feels like an existence. And it's interesting that you kind of have that, not even a contrast, just different forms of existence in relation to motherhood in a society which is so dominantly patriarchal. Just kind of an acceptance of different forms of relationship to this idea of motherhood, which has been so important in the society up to this point. I think that's something to keep in mind, something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I think the book really ultimately does kind of side with Dasha, of course. 308, she says, "Love will always be love, Gleb, but it requires a new form," which is really layered in the Kollontai debate of that time again, which is fascinating, it's just one of the reasons why I love this period. There's literally so much to get into.
Yeah.
There's so many like just weird and strange things happening in politics at this time.
It's like they're in What Is to Be Done by Chernyshevsky. Not a good book. Really interesting. Sorry, yeah. The party line now of the Cement Committee is that What Is to Be Done is maybe even the best book. It does suggest a lot of alternative forms of relationships, of both in the workplace and personal relationships, where even though I forget the main characters' names, the two of them are sort of a couple. They don't have any sort of sexual relationship. They sleep in different rooms. It's very different from traditional relationships of this era. And that's something that when we're getting to Cement and Love of Worker Bees, that's not just a theorization in a book or something that's kind of done by certain radical groups. That's something that they're trying to normalize in society. People are grappling with not just as a concept, but maybe as a widespread. Not that it would end up becoming that. Traditional values become strongly reasserted in the Stalinist era, but would become a much more widespread sort of conversation at this time. I mean, this very this kind of conversation in a modern book would probably get some people's hackles up. If it was a popular book which had this sort of discussion, I'm sure you would hear it on the news because someone would be protesting it.
Yeah. The other thing I was kind of looking at for the NEP period, New Economic Policy period, was also from Eric Naiman's book, and there are also definitely other people working on this, but he was the book I happened to read while I was taking class on this, on Cement, so hey, gets to mention again. The idea of the Soviet Gothic, about a lot of elements of Gothic literature starting to seep into the New Economic Policy period, basically essentially the pure socialist dream being haunted by the reoccurrence of the kind of capitalist remnants, is something that kind of starts to permeate the second half of the book. There's the part where somebody kind of vandalizes this poster that says, "He who does not work shall not eat," and they vandalize it so it says, "He who does work shall not eat." And just kind of the commentary, it's kind of broad in general, I guess, for the NEP period, but on just the way and the vigor with which some people were really working towards establishing this versus those who just kind of want to sit in a cafe, and that's, kind of it. There's a real, I think, kind of a willingness to engage with both sides of that. I mean, personally, not really a NEP fan, but hey.
You heard it here first. This is not a pro-NEP podcast.
Not a pro-NEP podcast. You're going to have to go down the street for that, buddy.
Yeah, Matt, when we were playing a board game, I think Matt was winning, and he did refer to himself as a NEP man through that entire process, which is a little weird, but, you do you, Matt. But yeah, I know, that's another interesting thing, that Makhova, ejected from the party, is sent to a sanitarium on a like pretty steep downfall from the head of the women's section. She's the only one who is unambiguously against the NEP, and she's portrayed as with negative characteristics for a lot of things. This is not one of them. She is ultimately, even by the ones who purge her from the party, say, yeah, you're kind of correct. This isn't really what we're going for, but you're too naive. You're too young. You don't understand the practical concessions we have to make, which is kind of the difference between Machova and Dasha. Dasha, I think, does have some of the same tendencies, but she does not speak out against the NEP because she's practical. Badin tried to sexually assault her, but she's practical. Badin is useful, and so she's not going to throw away a useful person. And you could look at that as like that's pretty cold logic, but you can't argue that Dasha doesn't get things done. She's maybe next to Badin the most effective at getting things done in this book. And they're portrayed as, their characterization is, these are the people we need right now. They're not the people we need in the long run, but, Machova, you were born too early. Sorry. Sergei, you were born too early.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of conclusion, and that's why I like this book so much. I think it's a little bit more ambiguous than people tend to give it credit for.
Oh, yeah. So much more. I mean, ambiguous enough that it had to be revised 40 times to remove. Later on, references to Sergei being a Menshevik are removed. This is after Tolstoy. Trotsky.
Oh, yes, after Tolstoy famously takes control of the Soviet
Union. After Trotsky is ejected from the party, the fact that Sergei is kind of portrayed as like right, but he's going to be right in like 20 years is obviously scrubbed from the novel. I think there's an essay in the back of this book. I think I put this in the show notes of the last Cement episode, but it's by Edward Vavra, and I'll put it again. He notes, he writes, what was it? Gladkov wanted a place in literature, not in Siberia. So many things like Sergei is no longer a Menshevik. He's now just kind of an idealist. The baby who's dead in the beach we mentioned before, it's wearing a red kind of headscarf, which is kind of, at least Vavra suggests that's suggesting the death of an innocent form of communism, because the headscarves are only represented by women throughout the book, and although Dasha kind of has, it's most associated with Machova, who at this point has been driven out of the party and sent to a sanitarium. So it's kind of suggesting the death of that sort of idealistic communism in place of a more practical communism, which incorporates some elements of capitalism in this particular case, or people like Badin. Of course, in later episodes and then later things, that was changed to a white scarf on the head of the baby, which is now an incoherent thematic thing, but a lot of things, like those were the things that were changed over the coming years that took out a lot. I mean, Dasha's agency and her sexuality is taken out. I don't know any specific references to Gleb's uncertainties about it are taken out, but I'm sure some of them are taken out, especially because the end of the book is largely about Gleb realizing that when Dasha joked about sleeping with Badin, she was not in fact kidding. So yeah, just a lot of what makes this an interesting novel was largely removed over time, which I guess says something about kind of the ideas that this book does have to put forth. It kind of reminds me of this line from Europe Central by William Bolman, which I'm only thinking of because I'm reading another book by William Bolman. In those days, we believed in books enough to burn them. Imagine. So imagine believing in a book enough that you have to censor it over the course of 40 years because it has that much staying power, but need to change the really radical elements of it.
Imagine. Indeed.
Imagine.
I could not.
Even sorry, I'm going back to Machova again because it's such an interesting character. Even when she says something about it, the officers who are purging the members, it really is there's a very thin barrier between this book and reality. They reference specifically like, oh, you're the kind of left wing communist who Lenin is against, and of course one of Lenin has many famous publications, but one of them is perhaps the most amusingly titled one.
Yes.
Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder.
An absolute clap.
just a good. Also, like not something you typically, for if you don't know that much about Soviet politics, not something you'd associate with Lenin. Him calling left-wing politics a infantile disorder, but different Overton window for that. But yeah, just I don't know. Is there anything else you really kind of was in your mind as you're approaching this?
I think that was kind of a cursory overview of my thoughts. I really do feel like I could talk about this. Like, I feel like I could have done like a 4-part series on this even. I feel like, well, our viewers would hate us, but I could have done it.
Maybe we'll come back if we ever have a slum month. We'll be coming back with a cement part 3 and part 4.
Just me thinking about it.
We just turn on our mics and just record for an hour, see what comes out, release it unedited. No, no one wants that. Least of all you and I.
Yeah, no kidding.
But if you've not read Cement, this is our official recommendation that you do in fact read Cement if you're interested in early Soviet politics. I will say that with the caveat that it's okay to skim. If you're getting to like a big section where he's just describing the sea, you can just skim on over that. Does not matter. Honestly, for a lot of this book, I was just like really like read the first and last sentence of a paragraph until I saw people talking, and then I'd like tune back in, because if it's not a discussion, it's really not that important.
Hey, respect Fyodor.
No, I think Fyodor was a really fascinating person to write. Like this is like a massive improvement on what is to be done by Chernyshevsky. Chernyshevsky was trying to write a novel where he was like kind of trying to put some ideas forth, and it really wasn't that good. Gladkov is like the next step up. He's not the best writer, obviously better than me. I'm not a good writer, but he, with much more skill, created characters in a setting. Yeah, so he's not the best prose writer, but he is a great character and writer, and a very good integrating extant politics into his work.
Yeah, I did feel that while I was reading this. It's essentially, he created a similar kind of feel to What Is to Be Done, in that it's really a novel of ideas, but it's also a readable novel, whereas What Is to Be Done is not readable, nor would I recommend it to anybody ever.
Except for specifically the scenes with, what's his name?
Rakhmetov.
Rakhmetov. Except for that, you should all read Rakhmetov's scene. I would film an adaptation of What Is to Be Done that's just Rakhmetov.
I was thinking the other day, like, what if I quit the podcast and I just became like a fitness buff, but I based it all on his workout, and I called the workout guide like What Is to Be Done. Get ripped in like 6 weeks. And then I sold like 1 million copies, and then I vanished from the face of the earth.
That's a good idea. Okay, but alternatively, what if we quit the podcast and became young adult authors, and instead wrote Russian classics, but from the perspective of other characters, like What Is to Be Done, but only from the perspective of Rakhmetov, or Cement, but only from the perspective of Mikhova and Sergei?
That is, I think you ventured into an even more niche audience than we currently have.
What are you talking? Everyone wants a book about Cement, but just from the perspective of the other point of view characters.
I can hardly convince anybody to read Cement normally.
Yeah, valid point.
All right.
This is going to be one of our longest episodes ever, and it's about Cement of all books.
That's right, baby. Get on that bandwagon. I'm going to make merch for it.
I'm sure Gladkov would love that.
It's going to be a gray shirt, and it's going to cost like $60. That's it.
All right, I'm looking forward to that.
It's my NEP shirt.
It just says Cement in like the like faux Cyrillic font on it.
I'd have to exile myself if I put something like that out on the internet.
Actually, the funny thing about Cement is if you put it in Cyrillic, even faux Cyrillic, it's almost entirely readable, both to people who read Cyrillic and the Latin alphabet. So could work.
Oh, you see, I'm sure somebody would fan if I did really mess it up.
All right, yeah, fair point.
All right, well, we've gone long enough on our schemes. So before we totally wrap up, on the scale from 1 to Yeltsin, how drunk are you?
Okay, so I admittedly have only had just one normal-sized 8% beer, but I would say I am high on the exhilaration of having a
Yes.
Baltika 9 again after not since 2018. So I'm giving myself a full. No, I've given myself an 11. I'm giving myself a 20.
Wow.
I'm high on the existence, on just remembering the many things that Baltika 9 is associated with. So realistically a 3, but other than that,
I'd call that a Yeltsin.
full Yeltsin. Yeah. Beyond Yeltsin could never. I don't think Yeltsin ever had access to Baltikas. So this is not something Yeltsin could have ever achieved.
And he also didn't have access to Baltika and then being cut off from Baltika for 3 years and then getting a Baltika. So
Yes, exactly. Yeltsin did not have access to Total Wine, so
No,
that's
that's
a
true.
big L for Yeltsin.
That's true.
What about you? Where are you at?
I'm probably like 3 or 4 because I was thinking more than I was drinking. But
Yeah, that's fair.
I'm having a good time. That counts.
We're having a great time. We're having a great time talking about early Soviet lit,
That's right.
which is our favorite part of the podcast, which is no one else's favorite part of the podcast. But
No. What I'm going to do is I'm going to title all the episodes Anna Karenina for SEO. And then I'm going to actually put the real title in the description.
just imagine the absolute disappointment of click on Anna Karenina part 13, and then it just opens up, and we're talking about Quiet Flows the Dawn.
I already get people mad that think we're an audiobook, and then they're like, I listened to like several minutes of this incessant chit chat. Like, first of all, if you didn't realize that we were not an audiobook within the first 10 seconds, shame on you.
Yeah. Well,
Anyways.
we're only at 3, but there's so much more banter than there normally is, even when we're much drunker.
Power cement.
True.
I'm dying to know, Cameron. What are we reading next episode?
Well, Matt, next week we will be reading Father Sergius by Leo Tolstoy. That's right, we're going back to Tolstoy, and we're going to be learning a little bit about the life of a saint, although not quite in the way you would expect.
Before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons. We've got Drew, Jeff, Janice, Ann, Jesse, Madeline, Alex, Daniel, Irini, Paige, Darren, Larkin, Lou, Brandon, Allison, Gary, Cole, Daniel, Jack, Lucy, Alex, and Roland. Podcasting isn't free, and grad school doesn't pay very well, so if you're interested in joining with our current patrons to keep the show running, take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy.
The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast or join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
You'll hear from us again soon.